This is KSL Sunday Edition with Boyd Matheson.
Welcome to Sunday Edition. I am Boyd Matheson. Each Sunday we attempt to divide the rage from the reason, elevate the conversation, connect the dots, and make the news make sense. We have conversations with great thinkers, great leaders, and great people making a difference. We talk politics so we can discuss society. We explore society so we can discuss principles and the people in America who actually live them. We bring the best and brightest minds all around the world to Utah, and we send the Utah model to our nation's capital and beyond. Today we begin with someone who's been leading such conversations each Sunday morning for the past 9 years on Meet the Press. NBC's Chuck Todd joins us as we're early on in our new era here on Sunday Edition as he prepares to close out an extraordinary run on Meet the Press. Chuck, thanks for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Love the mission.
All right. Well, you've interviewed and facilitated conversations with a wide array of leaders from across the country and around the world. You've really been on the set and in the chair when magic moments happen, and a few sparks have flown over the years. I want to ask you, what are the most important principles? We always get to principles on this show. What principles have you learned from those conversations?
Well, I go back to something that I learned on the very first day after I accepted this posting, and that was some research from viewers. Was the number one reason why they watched a Sunday morning show, and it was to be educated. That was the number one reason. They would say, and it was different ways they would say educated. Well, I want to be able to talk at work. I want to be able to converse on this. I don't have time during the week. But the point was they wanted to learn. And I think sometimes we forget as journalists that our core function in society are teachers. We're teaching people something every day. Maybe it's new information. Maybe it's something they hadn't realized they needed to know. But ultimately, if you, especially when you're in these long positions where you get to have a longer conversation, if you always have your North Star as you're trying to educate the viewer on something that you don't think they fully either know the context of or what it is. But if you always are keeping that as your North Star, which is informing the viewer, not affirming with them, right? Unfortunately, there's a lot of media and our incentive structures. I mean, unfortunately, there's a business incentive to essentially follow the viewer. But of course, if you do that, you end up not informing the viewer.
Yeah, you end up in the ditch for sure. So one of the things I love about the way you approach Meet the Press is the fact that you're a forever learner, you're always curious, so that allows you not only to ask a great first question, but more importantly, the real important follow-up question, which is the real key. And in all those questions and follow-up questions, give me one of those moments or one of those people that really surprised you, where you actually learned something as you were in the context of that discussion.
Well, I point to an early interview I did that was loaded with potential confrontation. And that was the former Vice President Dick Cheney came on the show to defend himself from a report that Dianne Feinstein at the time, who was the head of the Intelligence Committee, was essentially known as the torture report. That wasn't the official name, and certainly people didn't like using that, but it was essentially it, right? What was done during the war in Iraq? What did the CIA do? Did we do waterboarding? Should we have done it? All of that, right? The enhanced interrogation, torture, however you wanted to do it. And Dick Cheney could have gone down what I'd say the Lindsey Graham road and just made it a political back and forth.
Right.
Well, and made it about me asking the question, or somehow the Democrats writing it this way. Dick Cheney came about it, and he believed he was trying to explain his position. And he used, look, that's what I've always appreciated about the Cheneys in general. I think we've seen it with Liz Cheney, which is, look, they're very, they're not directional wind people, right?
Yeah.
They're not going to just put their finger in the wind. But they will explain to you why they think the way they think.
Yeah.
And what he did is he spent a lot of time on the why. I thought it was going to be this contentious personal thing, and it wasn't. But he also didn't feel like he owed an apology to anybody either.
Yeah, right.
But my point was, it was it was that kind of interview, which is, I think, what we all want more of on Sunday mornings.
So important. And one of the things that's become a real head-scratching topic of controversy these days is freedom of the press. We live at a time when there's a lot of distrust in institutions, government, the press included. When we come back, we're going to dive into that a little bit in terms of what's the path forward in restoring trust. We're also going to talk about what's next for Chuck Todd when he signs off for the final time on a Sunday morning on Meet the Press. Stay with us. We'll be right back on Sunday Edition. We're staying with the conversation a little bit longer with NBC's Chuck Todd and Meet the Press. Chuck, as we were going to break, we wanted to get into this area of freedom of the press and trust in our institutions, including the press. After all of this decade-long run almost on Meet the Press, what's the takeaway? What's the path forward in trust?
Well, look, it always starts with transparency, right? And I think that's number one. And I've always been a believer in that. Unfortunately, sometimes transparency gets weaponized on people.
Yeah.
But ultimately, sunshine does more to disinfect anything than anything else. My concern is that there's a lot of elected officials who are so afraid of the current version of the media that that it becomes self-reinforcing. They won't come on and all this stuff. And on one hand, I understand because, when people say they don't trust the media, I always say, well, what do you define as the media, right? And then they'll start telling you things they don't like about the media. And I'm like, yeah, I don't like that either. Do you know we don't do that? That's done over here, or that's done over there, or that's done on that platform. Now, I get it. Why? You and I are well-versed in how to navigate. I know what stories are BS and which ones aren't. I know which reporters are well-sourced and which one aren't. But that's not fair to the average citizen has their own jobs and families to worry about. That's not their full-time job. And look, if you were to ask me if we could get rid of one thing, we shouldn't ever use a metric of interest in a story as the rationale to cover a news story. And I say this, look, not for news, okay? I'm not saying there shouldn't be a style section, but I would argue one of the core mistakes we made, the worst lessons learned by our bosses, and when I say our bosses, not the ones now, but sort of the people, the bean counters that own all of our companies. When they found out with the coverage of O.J. Simpson that you could make money on, quote, news, well then news executives were forced to always find stuff that kept viewer interest. Yeah. And if you're only covering what viewers are interested in, you are not going to inform the viewer well.
Yeah.
And guess what? This is not a TV problem. Look at the most emailed story, the most read story. Why is that a metric?
Yeah.
That should not be a metric for news. If I could get rid of one thing in every website in America, it would be the most read, most emailed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we let you go, Chuck, when you get to that final time where you say if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press, what do you hope the legacy is? And then give us a 30-second look into what's next for your conversations.
Well, to me, look, the beauty of Meet the Press is I was a custodian. It's the longest running show in television history, period. So when I hand the baton to Kristen Welker, I've succeeded. My goal was to make sure I wasn't the last moderator. And my goal is and I want Kristen's goal to make sure she's not the last moderator. The point is that Meet the Press is something that is its own distinct brand, its own entity. It means something to people. I want it to still mean something to people. And I do think, look, I'm pretty proud of this tenure. Other than the McCarthy era, I don't know what's been more tumultuous in our post-World War II history. Look, I'm proud of the work I did. I think it'll age well. And look, my goal is to continue to educate. Whether I just think I could be more effective in another chair. I think everybody has a sell-by date in certain positions.
Yeah.
And I wanted to leave before I spoiled. And so I feel like I've pulled that off.
Fantastic. Chuck Todd, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to your continued work at NBC as you continue to have important conversations all around the country. Well, it was a big week here in the Beehive State as President Joe Biden made a visit to the state, talking about the PACT Act and talking about things that were happening here in the state. Also did a little bit of political fundraising while he was here up in Park City. And it's always a big deal when Air Force One comes cruising in. That's always an extraordinary sight to see. Some amazing moments on the tarmac there with Governor Spencer Cox and Mayors Mendenhall and Wilson. It was interesting how long those conversations went on. I think that really set the tone and tenor for what the president was trying to do in terms of his Unity Act, his idea of uniting the nation around a few things, including this work for our veterans. And that really became the focal point in a speech that the president delivered at the VA.
This goes beyond the financial. We have a moral obligation to respond to this. And I'm here today to spread the word so every veteran or surviving family member knows how to access benefits of this law. They breathe that toxic material sometimes for months at a time. In the case of my son and his buddies, for an entire year.
That was an important speech by the president, and I think the components of the PACT Act are significant. It's one of those things where when we send our brave women and men into battle, we need to make sure we give them very specific objectives, all the resources they need. And then most important, when they come home, we need to keep our promises to them, and we need to keep those promises to their families when they don't. This is an area that the president knows all too well with his own family connection with his son, Beau. And I thought the president connected and scored some unique moments, some personal moments, which is where I think the president is always at his best. Always interesting in events like this. Often it's the speech you're not expecting that can become the best speech of the day. I happen to think that Governor Spencer Cox actually delivered the best speech of the day while the president was here. Take a listen.
We welcome President Biden to the Beehive State. Anytime we get the opportunity to have a president of either party in our state, we appreciate this amazing opportunity that we have to collaborate, to work closely together, to push back on policies with which we disagree, and to find areas of common ground. There has been some question over whether or not the governor of the state of Utah would welcome the president of a different party. I think it's insane that we are having those conversations in our country today.
That was a great moment, I think, for Governor Spencer Cox, again, talking about the fact that we can push back on things. And clearly, the governor was referencing what the president had done in Arizona just a day and a half before in declaring a very large national monument. But because the governor didn't go at that with a hammer, he went at it with some diplomacy and had some important conversations, particularly in the motorcade as they traveled to the hotel with the president, where I think they were actually able to have a meaningful conversation. I think the governor also set the tone in terms of what we do moving forward. Also critical. You have to have a relationship with the president of the United States, and I think the governor did well to make sure that while we can have our differences, we can disagree on policy, we can always come together, especially when it comes to things like our veterans and making sure they're taken care of. Again, always interesting to see the president in the state and what happens as a result of it. So important that we look at those particular things. The politics of it all was afterwards. The governor went up to Park City, and the tone changed just a little bit as the governor went up there. It turned much more to the political side. But I will say, from those who were in the room where the president spoke, they talked about the fact that he didn't go all politics. It wasn't just about demeaning and demagoguing the other side. It was really about a hopeful future in terms of how we come together. And that's a good day for the president. I thought it was a good day for the state of Utah as well. Well, coming up next, we're going to take a look at the actual role and responsibilities of the President of the United States, how we've drifted away from presidents truly leading as executive of the executive branch, and what we actually have to do to restore the right focus that will best serve the American people. We'll be right back. More Sunday Edition coming up next. With President Joe Biden's visit to Utah this week, it's a good opportunity to examine the actual duties of the president. The Constitution plainly lays out the roles and responsibilities of the President of the United States: make treaties, appoint judges, execute the laws passed by Congress, serve as Commander-in-Chief of the military, and a few more. But over the years, the focus has shifted from executive leader to political performer, rhetorical inspirer, to grievance validator. The question for me is, are we losing the real power and the real purpose of the presidency? Phillip Wallach is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and author of Why Congress, a fabulous read. He recently took a deep dive look at what he calls the emotive presidency. Phillip, welcome to Sunday Edition.
Glad to be with you.
So give our viewers just a little bit of a background in terms of what is this emotive presidency that we have evolved into?
Sure. So I think what it comes down to is the president, as you said in your introduction, has a bunch of important duties. Commander-in-chief, head of the executive branch, charged with taking care that the laws are faithfully executed. That's a big job as an administrator. But over time, the president has come to be seen as sort of the most important political leader of the country. The most famous person in the world is part of what being the president is all about today. And so what we've seen in recent years is that presidents are leaning into their role as the most famous person of the world and the way that they can use that platform to make their political supporters happy by telling them what they want to hear. And if that were just sort of on top of all the other parts of being president, that might be one thing. But I would argue it's really come at the expense of focusing on those core constitutional duties.
Yeah, I think that's such an important thing to be looking at because, again, it's I think President Obama really leaned into that as the digital age and social media began to evolve. A lot more of the aspirational language, bumper sticker slogans, and it really got away from this whole idea of the president is the chief executive. It's the executive branch for a reason. But tell us why that is. Is part of that the fact that Congress continues to abdicate its power to the executive branch, or what else is getting in the way, or just wanting to be popular with the people?
Well, I think part of it is that, political scientists have talked about sort of a rhetorical presidency for a few decades now. And there was a sense that the president was sort of putting himself out there trying to be all things to all people, sort of embracing soaring generalities as a way of trying to depoliticize things sometimes. And that would sometimes work, but more often was disappointing. And so what you've seen more recently is that the presidents, rather than even trying to be all things to all people, are willing to just say, I'm just going to be a straight up partisan and deliver to my base something that makes them feel good. And unfortunately, that can take the form of just social media engagement. We see more and more sort of governing by social media, which doesn't actually work. And we see, the electorate, unfortunately, doesn't seem to punish this behavior. They often just take the win in the news cycle and lose track of the bigger issues and whether things are actually getting done.
Yeah, and it does seem to be much more of a representative president in terms of really getting things, not getting things done, but just, as you said, talking about what the people want to hear seems to be the real question. And so tell us, Philip, just real quickly, what is it that we need to do going forward? How do we change the dynamic and get back to what the president is supposed to be?
Well, our big hope is that people will just get fed up with the inanity of the current moment. Just sort of the sense that our presidents are sort of losing touch from reality in many cases. They're so excited to make the other side look bad that they're just not addressing the real problems on the ground. And the people have recourse. They can, first of all, go to their legislators and say, hey, we're not just going to rely on this president who seems more and more detached. We can try to elect members of Congress who are going to focus on our actual day-to-day problems and look for ways of addressing those through legislation by building coalitions and getting away from the abstractions and culture warring and all that so often takes us into a realm where there are no real winners. It's always just sort of mutual assassination. So I think we have to decenter the presidency to some extent. The more we just focus on the president and allow him to dominate our attention, I think that just tends to reinforce this dynamic, unfortunately.
Yeah, great perspective. Phil, Phillip Wallach from American Enterprise Institute, author of Why Congress, a great read, a great look at why Congress matters and how we need to make sure we get the president back. Phillip, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
A final thought to close out the program. Presidents and politicians from both political parties spend an inordinate amount of time attacking their enemies, belittling could-be critical allies on important issues, engaging in public displays of shoulder shrugging and finger pointing and placing blame. But you know, none of these activities lead to the kind of leadership the American people, and the world for that matter, desperately need. In challenging times, great leaders always call the American people to something, even if it's just a call to the principles of freedom, of liberty, and personal character. Abraham Lincoln called the American people to their better angels. John F. Kennedy called on every citizen to ask what you can do for your country. A call to character is a call to personal responsibility. So we don't need to look to the marbled halls of Washington to know how to react or to how to act in troubling times, because it's our character, individual and collective, as a nation, that we should actually look to. You know, it's been said that true soldiers fight not because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him. And whether that soldier is a soldier or a social worker, an executive or an employee, a professional or a parent, a neighbor or a friend, millions of Americans get up every morning to fight, not for personal riches or glory, but in their own way to provide safety and security, opportunity and hope for those they love at home and those in their community. Calling on the better natures and the better angels of the American people, I think, is actually the best way to ensure that America remains freedom's last best hope on earth. A call to character is actually what the nation needs. Thanks for watching Sunday Edition. I'm Boyd Matheson. And remember, as always, as you go out into the world today, make sure you see something that inspires, say something that uplifts, and do something that makes a difference. Music and the spoken word is next.